The third capsule under Gender, Constitution and Law is titled Equality and its Challenges. And in order to discuss this capsule, I'm actually referring to the 1970s and two moments in the 1970s with respect to the women's question in India, which addresses the constitution on the one hand and also the Indian Penal Code or criminal law on the other hand. It is important for us to remember that while in 1950 we gave ourselves a new constitution, post 1947, that is after independence of India, and after the Constitution of 1950, we, however, continued with the Indian Penal Code, which was adopted by the colonial rulers. So there were two documents, a constitution as a document, which is the futuristic vision of India, which we gave to ourselves, but also a carrying on of a document, which is the Indian Penal Code from the 1870s. These two documents carried on, and we do that even today. So the complexity around what it is to be a post-colonial nation state and what is it to the women in these post-colonial nation states which carry on with colonial legal systems, but also give to themselves their own legal and philosophical documents. This debate is something that we actually see in the 1970s through two moments coming out very, very importantly. The first moment is something that I referred to in the second capsule, which is the publishing of the Towards Equality report in 1974. Now, this Towards Equality report came out through the creation of the Committee for the Status of Women in India. And if I quote from the introduction of this report, it says that there was a committee on the status of women that was constituted in 1971 by the government of India. And this committee had the following terms of reference. Some of these terms of references were, number one, to examine the constitutional, legal, and administrative provisions that have a bearing on the social status of women, their education, and employment. Number two, to assess the impact of these provisions during the last 2 decades on the status of women in the country, particularly in the rural sector, and to suggest more effective programs. Number three, to consider the development of education among women and determine the factors responsible for the slow progress. Number four, to survey the problems of working women. Number five, to examine the status of women as housewives and mothers in the changing social pattern and their problems in the sphere of further education and employment. Number six, to undertake survey or case studies on the implications of the population policy and family planning program. And number seven, to suggest any other measures which would enable women to play their full and proper role in building up of the nation. What I hope we will all remember is that the terms of reference that this committee is entrusted with is actually to figure out and find out that a constitution has been adopted in 1950. 20 years after the existence of the constitution, what is the empirical reality of women citizens in India? And how do you better that reality so that they can serve the nation better? And this particular objective of serving the nation better and serving the nation equally was also part of what the 15 women who were part of the Constituent Assembly spoke about. If we just look into the titles of the Towards Equality report, the chapter titles of the Towards Equality report, then we will understand that we have actually not got any other comprehensive report on the status of women in India since 1974. One of the chapters is the demographic perspective. Another chapter is titled Socio-Cultural Setting of Women's Status, which discusses women and religion, women and family, women and marriage, etc. One chapter is titled Women and Law. Another chapter is titled Roles, Rights and Opportunities for Economic Participation. The sixth chapter is titled Educational Development. The seventh chapter is titled Political Status. The eighth chapter is titled Policies and Programs for Women's Welfare and Development. And finally, there is a summary of recommendations. I'm sure all of us understand that it literally covers all aspects of women's life, from the private sphere to the public sphere, and also the kind of institutional and state-based mechanisms and schemes that have come in place to better the situation of women in India. In terms of the belief and recommendation that the committee makes in the Towards Equality report, I'll read out from the report 3 or 4 points. Number one, that equality of women is necessary not merely on the grounds of social justice, but as a basic condition for social, economic, and political development of the nation. Number two, that society owes a special responsibility to women because of their childbearing function. Safe bearing and rearing of children is an obligation that has to be shared by the mother, the father, and the society. Number three, that the contribution made by an active housewife to the running and management of a family should be admitted as economically and socially productive and contributing to national savings and development. And finally, that if our society is to move to the direction of the goals set by the Constitution, then special temporary measures will be necessary to transform de jure into de facto equality. And one only remembers what Dr. Ambedkar said in his last speech, that democracy has to be understood in fact as well as in form. And the Towards Equality report, by making some of these observations, clearly are suggesting the importance of women's productive and socially productive role in the society. And very interestingly, we will also understand and acknowledge that how relevant this report is in the contemporary times, where at this moment, through court judgments, etc., we are actually discussing wages for housework, which is connected with something that the report is saying, that it is important to recognize the role that an active housewife plays in running and managing the family, and also the fact that it is important to understand that rearing up of the child is not just the role of the mother, but is a role of the family, but more importantly, also of the society. So how is it that you ensure these these principles of social reproduction is something that the Towards Equality report did talk about. If we move to another moment in the 1970s, it's a moment which comes in 1979. And this moment is enshrined by a very significant open letter that was written by 4 professors, 3 of them from the University of Delhi and 1 from the University of Pune. Professor Upendra Bakshi, Professor Vasudha Dhagambar, Professor Raghunath Kelkar, and Professor Lothika Sarkar. All of these professors had written an open letter to the Chief Justice of India, challenging a Supreme Court judgment on rape. It has been famously known as the Mathura rape judgment. And this open letter critiqued the judgment that the Supreme Court had delivered, in which the most contentious issue was around did Mathura consent to the sexual intercourse, or was it rape? Mathura, a tribal girl, probably a minor. The age factor remained debated throughout the trial court, to the Bombay High Court, to the Supreme Court judgments. But most importantly, did Mathura consent or not consent? And we all know that consent, proving consent, is the most important issue in any kind of rape jurisprudence. I would quote a couple of sentences from this open letter, which I believe is one of the first attempts which talks about what is the importance of the courts and what is the importance of the judiciary in enshrining the values of the Indian Constitution, and how is it that these values, when enshrined, they need to keep in mind the socio-economic status of a marginalized person who is approaching the court of law. So, not talking about intersectional feminism, this open letter is a good example of intersectional feminism. I quote from the letter. The court gives no consideration whatsoever to the socio-economic status, the lack of knowledge of legal rights, the age of the victim, the lack of access to legal services, and the fear complex which haunts the poor and the exploited in Indian police stations. May we respectfully suggest that yourself and your distinguished colleagues visit incognito, wearing the visage of poverty, some police stations in villages adjoining Delhi. Another part that I would want to quote from this judgment is the following. We also find it surprising that the Supreme Court should have only focused on one of the components of Section 375 of the Indian Penal Code, which applies when rape is committed with the woman's consent, which is when her consent has been obtained by putting her in fear of death or of hurt. However, another component of this same Section 375 is when rape occurs without her consent. There is a clear difference in law and common sense between submission and consent. Consent involves submission, but the converse is not necessarily true, nor is the absence of resistance necessarily an indicator of consent. So by conceptually making this distinction between submission and consent, and on the other hand, by raising this very important question of the marginalized who approach courts of justice, and what is it that the judiciary needs to do to ensure that people from different marginalized communities can access courts of justice and actually get justice. For both these reasons, this open letter is a very, very significant moment in the 1970s. That is 1979, when this letter was written. Post the open letter, nationwide, we have women's movements campaigning, demanding rape law reforms. And the 1980s is actually the first time that there is a number of reforms that happen in the rape law. Something that happens in more contemporary times after the Delhi gang rape in 2012. So towards equality, which clearly indicates that while the Constitution legally enshrines equality, substantively, women's position still remains moving towards equality, as if walking towards equality. And the open letter, by emphasizing and talking about the marginalized and their access to justice, this debatable and troubled issue of consent and submission in rape, what we see in the 1970s are equality and its challenges. What I would think is close to the political philosophical concept of redistribution, as the concept note of the refresher course says. How do you, after having enshrined equality, how do you ensure and redistribute that amongst your citizens. And not just understand women as a homogeneous entity, but also understand the heterogeneity of women and ensure redistribution of equality and resources.